Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Adams, and this is the LD14 podcast. Today, our guest is Chad Thompson, who is the school board member for Gilbert Public Schools. Today, Chad and I are going to be having a discussion about social emotional learning. Social emotional learning supporters claim that it gives students the tools to be successful in school, work, and life. It's a very in-depth process, and we're happy to have Chad here to explain it to us. Chad?
Hey, Andrew. Thank you very much for having me on the podcast. Excited to be here and talk about some of my thoughts on social emotional learning, what the impact of it is on our kids, and more importantly, on the future of our country.
So before we get into Chad's presentation, I'd like to have Chad tell us a little bit about himself and a little bit about why he does what he does. Chad?
So my name is Chad Thompson. Like Andrew said, I'm a school board member for Gilbert Public Schools. And I do want to make clear that I'm one of 5 school board members. All of the school board members, we all come to the table with our different backgrounds and different perspectives. And so this is just, some of the things we're going to be talking about today are just my perspective, and they don't necessarily reflect philosophies of Gilbert Public Schools.
Sure.
I was raised in Yuma, Arizona, and one of 4 boys. My poor mother, she's a saint. And, well, my grandpa always had on his desk this little box. And on top of the box, it said, "The secret to success." And you'd open it up, and it would say work. And so we were all raised with this incredible work ethic and just a desire to always be doing something to improve our station. My dad had a good quote where he would say, "Whatever your lot in life, build on it." And I've taken that to heart and just tried to make every situation that I'm in better. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. But that's a little bit about me growing up. Been married to my wife for 20 years, 21 years this July. We've got 4 children. I've got a daughter that's 17 and going to graduate this year, and another daughter that's 10, and we homeschool her. And then I've got 2 young boys. One is 7. He's a second grader at Ashland Ranch Elementary School, and then a 4-year-old. I'm really excited. Both my boys just started baseball. I'm a big baseball fan, and so it's exciting to see them get excited about it. So that's a little bit about me. I should say my profession, I'm a real estate investor. I own a business called We Buy Ugly Houses, to tell people that I help people get out of ugly situations. So when people need to sell their homes for any one of 100 different reasons, we try to help them out. So,
very cool. Well, Chad, that's quite an inspiring story. I'm obviously the chairman of Legislative District 14. I live in Gilbert. I actually went to public schools. I was a student in the Chandler Unified School District through elementary school, through high school. And I see a lot of changes in our public schools that I don't think were there when I was a student there. So I'm always interested in learning more about how curriculum is made, the types of teaching tactics that are out there right now. And so we've been looking at social emotional learning. And there are many, many aspects to this in which I find very interesting. So without further ado, we're going to have Chad Thompson give us a presentation on social emotional learning. Chad?
Thanks, Andrew. So I want to start out by saying that a lot of the facts and details that we're going to talk about today and that are presented in the slides that I've got, I really took a deep dive into social emotional learning when I learned what it was. And so a lot of the things that I'm going to be talking about today are things that I've gotten from other people that are much smarter than me, that they've shared publicly, and I've just kind of condensed them into a shorter presentation, because if we were to really expound what social emotional learning is, we could be here for days and days. So the first thing that I want to share with people is that, in my opinion, our schools and what our children are taught and how they're taught is the most important topic that we can focus on today. Let me explain that a little bit. There's a lot of things going on around the world, around our country, that people want to change. People want to either go back to the way they were, or they want to reform things. But in reality, what our kids are taught in school is how they will think 10, 15, 20 years down the road.
Yeah.
And so if there's something that anybody wants changed, it only makes sense, let's teach it to the kids. And then when the kids grow up and get into positions of power themselves, then they'll kind of have the mindset that we want them to have, or that they should have, to be able to affect those changes. But I think if I go to this first slide, this will help clarify. So this is a quote from Abraham Lincoln. He said, "The philosophy in the classroom of one generation will be the philosophy of the government in the next." And so I think where we're at with our government today, I think those seeds were sown many, many years ago. And so if we want to affect change in our country, in our republic, then we have to start sowing the seeds today of what we want the outcome to be down the road. And so that's what I mean when I say this is the most important thing. And to be honest with you, it's probably some of the lowest hanging fruit as well. I mean, parents can come, anybody can come to a school board meeting and voice their opinion and affect change that will change what and how our children are taught.
No, I love that philosophy. So I love the idea of planting seeds. I'm not someone who believes that most things can be done with the swipe of a pen or in an instant. I think planting seeds and pushing both your country and your community in a direction over time is one of the most strategically wise things we can be doing. Yeah, and
it's interesting that we're talking about planting seeds. We're not the only ones that know the importance of planting seeds. But people that don't have the best of intentions, they also want to plant seeds that they can reap the benefit of years and years down the road. And so I think it's important to note that both sides are trying to plant these seeds. The bad part for us as conservative parents is that those on the more liberal side of things have been planting these seeds for the past 50 years. And so what has happened is during COVID, parents were brought right into the classroom. When their kids were doing their school at home on their laptops, parents could see what's going on in the classroom, what our kids are being taught. And it really woke a lot of parents up to the truth that there's some things being taught that we don't want our kids being taught. And when people talk about social emotional learning, it sounds very flowery. It sounds very good. I mean, especially after coming out of a pandemic, who doesn't want our kids to get some social and emotional healing?
I often see that. I don't think even our adversaries who plant these seeds that you're talking about, I don't think that their end game in their mind is harm to these kids. I think that both of these people are trying to push these kids in a direction where they feel supported, where they feel safe. I just think we have different ways of getting there. And I think we have different ways of developing these kids so that they can be the kind of individuals that even social emotional learning claims they want these individuals to become.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's hard for me. I'm very optimistic, and it's hard for me to think that anybody would do anything to our children and to their education with the intent to do them harm.
Sure.
Unfortunately, I think there are people in power, and I'm not just talking about here locally, but nationwide and even worldwide, that want a particular outcome and are willing to reach that outcome at the expense of our children and their education.
Sure.
And so that's what we're going to talk a little bit more about later on. So trying to teach people what social emotional learning is pretty difficult because we have to kind of bounce back and forth between what was it originally set up and designed for, to what it is today, to how it evolved into what it is today. And so I'll try to do the best I can. But I want to start out by talking about the origins of social emotional learning. And originally, social emotional learning was a program, as it says here on the slide, a program meant to intervene on troubled learners one-on-one or in a small group setting in a regulated space by a licensed psychologist/therapist. And so originally, this was used for the benefit of students that were struggling, typically in lower socioeconomic groups, typically in largely Black communities, where these teachers or these counselors or psychologists could identify kids that were struggling for a number of reasons, most commonly because of a really tough and troubled home life. And so what they found is that if these students were intervened upon at a particular stage and were given some social and emotional tools to help them regulate emotions, to help them get through situations, to help them see situations in a particular way, then the outcome for success was a lot more likely. And they actually had tremendous success with the program early on when they were doing it one-on-one or in these small groups. But the difference today, and I'll actually just skip forward, the difference between that and today is we're no longer doing social emotional learning one-on-one or in small groups. What we're doing today is we're practicing clinical psychology without a license in unregulated, non-therapeutic spaces on groups of children. So what I mean by that is teachers are given lessons, given curricula to teach their students that should be taught one-on-one with kids that are struggling. And kind of the best way for me to relate this to something that I think a lot of people would understand is to relate it to chemotherapy for cancer patients. So if someone has cancer, one of the most common ways to try to cure that is through chemotherapy. But what social emotional learning is today is essentially the distribution of chemotherapy drugs in the public water supply. So chemotherapy is not going to do well for people that don't have the problem, don't have cancer, but we're going to go ahead and give it to everybody. And so that's how I kind of equate social emotional learning to something that I think everybody can understand, is we're putting social emotional learning in the hands of non-professional psychologists to teach to all of our children in mass. And that's where the real problem comes in, because a lot of our kids don't need social emotional learning. Some students do, and in those cases, again, those one-on-one environments with qualified professionals, it can be very helpful to our kids. But by having teachers distribute it or teach it to all of our kids, as we're going to find out, is really doing a lot more harm than good. And I do want to point out that I think the vast majority of teachers that are being told to teach social emotional learning, they don't know exactly what it is or where it comes from. Some of them do, and that's a big problem, because they are purposefully trying to use our children to create an outcome down the road that they want. And that's where we have a big problem. But I want to make it clear that the vast majority of people that are teaching, of teachers that are teaching social emotional learning, I think are doing it with the understanding that, like we said before, social emotional learning it's great. It's going to be good for our kids. It's teaching our kids. But some of the things that are going on behind the scenes that teachers don't see, they're not aware of.
So it sounds kind of like social emotional learning has really evolved over the years from what it began as. It sounds like when it's practiced in the right method with a licensed therapist, there can be some benefit to it. But like I said, it seems like social emotional learning has really evolved over the years. So could you give us some history on how that's developed and what kinds of things we saw in that development?
Yeah, you bet. So we've got a slide up on the screen with a timeline of sorts of the history of social emotional learning. And we've already talked about the first bullet point, where social emotional learning began in the 1960s at the Yale School of Medicine and its Child Study Center by a gentleman named James Comer. And James Comer was the one that originally pioneered this, that had success with students one-on-one or in small groups. But as James Comer released his findings and other people picked it up and kind of ran with it, we can see through this timeline how it's changed. And every time somebody's picked it up and run with it, it has progressed into a closer version of what we're actually seeing today. So in 1987, it was picked up by Timothy Shriver and Dr. Roger Weisberg in New Haven, Connecticut, and they established the New Haven Social Development Program. And that's when they began experimenting in classroom settings. And I want to draw focus to that word experimenting, because really this is an experiment on our kids. And I've done a lot of reading and listening to other experts, as I said before, and I want to share with you just some things that advocates of social emotional learning, they actually say themselves. So this isn't something that I'm making up. It's not my perception. It's not what I think they want. This is what they actually want. And if this doesn't make the hair on the back of your neck stand up, then I don't know what will. But in one of these texts called the Handbook of Social Emotional Learning, Research and Practice, which was one of the authors of it was this woman named Linda Darling Hammond. And Linda Darling Hammond, she's on our timeline a little later on in the presentation. She's the one that really made social emotional learning into what it is today. She really saw it as a way to change the course of our country slowly over time by altering the way our kids think. Okay, and so these are some of the things that they actually say in their own words. There's a lack of consensus about measurements. So they don't even know what they're measuring. In a different sense, they're building the plane while they're flying it. There aren't enough studies out to show that social emotional learning taught to kids in classroom settings is positive in any way. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lack of consensus about measurements. Here's another thing that they say. They say stakeholders still lack consensus on the definition of social emotional learning and measuring outcomes. So they can't even agree on what social emotional learning means. And to be teaching that in our schools to millions of kids every day across the country, in my opinion, should be criminal. We don't put out a new brand of makeup, testing it in small doses to pigs and other animals, and eventually it evolves to testing it on humans. We haven't done any of that. We just said, let's go full bore and let's just throw it in. We're going to go all in and teach all our kids this.
Sounds a lot like our federal government operating, passing bills before they read them, or
I think that's a very astute observation. This is another thing that they've said. The OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. The OECD is a member of the UN Global Compact, and its report, Measuring Distance, well, we'll go into that later, but anyway, that's who the OECD is. And in this text, it says the OECD is shifting its emphasis from literacy and numeracy skills from employment towards empowering all citizens with cognitive, social, and emotional capacities and values to contribute to the success of tomorrow's world.
That is so sad.
So I want to say that first part again. The OECD is shifting its emphasis from literacy and numeracy, the reason we send our kids to school, toward empowering all citizens with cognitive, social, and emotional capacities and values. And that's another buzzword that I want to draw attention to. As a parent, I want my kids to have the values that I instill in them. I don't want them going to school and getting somebody else's interpretation of what their values are. Like I said, a lot of people think about social emotional learning. They talk about social emotional learning, and it sounds very good. Our kids are going to learn how to handle themselves in certain situations. Our kids are going to learn what it means to be kind, to include new people that they encounter, to make sure they're not excluding anyone. It sounds very good, but the monkey wrench is thrown in when we look at how those values are interpreted and by whom they're being interpreted. One last quote that I want to read here from this book, The Social Emotional Learning, the Handbook for Social Emotional Learning, it says, the OECD is shifting its ambitions from shaping national level education systems to intervening in the shaping of children's personalities to achieve economic ends. So again, I want to read that. I want that to sink into everybody's brains. The OECD is shifting its ambitions from shaping national level education systems to intervening in the shaping of children's personalities to achieve economic ends.
That is just mind-blowing. And to think that at a time like this, when Arizona schools and students are struggling, to hear that the management of these facilities and organizations is more focused on developing personality than focusing on academics is a real concern for us. We know, especially when combined with COVID, what an impact that had on our kids' education. And I don't think, it's just my opinion, but I don't think we can afford a shift away from focusing on academics at this point.
Yeah, I think you're right. So I've got a couple thoughts on this. So many people say that education needs to be reimagined or revamped. It needs to be broken down and rebuilt, something like that. And my first question is why? Why does education need to be reimagined? The goal of our education system has always been to prepare students to be productive in a free capitalist society. And so if the goal is now to change or to reimagine education, what is the new outcome that we want for our children that would require education be reimagined? Does it mean that maybe people that are at the top or people that are in charge are imagining a future where we don't have a free capitalist society? And so that's just something to think about. That's something that I think about is why are we in such a hurry to change education when it has worked very well, in my opinion, for so many years? I mean, our nation is a leader in technology. Our nation is a leader in everything you can imagine. And the people that are driving that are people that have gone through the American education system, people that have gone to school to focus on literacy and numeracy. But if we're now changing our focus from literacy and numeracy to shaping personalities for a financial gain, I think we're on a road that we don't want to be on.
I would ask the question, isn't it knowledge in literacy and mathematics and success in your academics that develops personal respect and develops the person overall? I always felt like, success is what, in any way, is what helps to build somebody. So it doesn't sound to me like that's the focus anymore. It doesn't sound like the focus is focusing on academics and then letting the result of that thrive and build up the individual. It sounds like instead the focus is going to be on trying to form the individuals in a certain way so that they can adhere to some kind of new goal of society or some new vision of society.
Yeah. So it's been kind of a running joke, this concept of when our kids play sports, we don't keep score anymore. There's not a winner and a loser, but everybody at the end of the season gets a participation award. In my opinion, that's what we're turning our education system into. We are not allowing our children to learn what they need to learn. We're not allowing our children to have responsibilities. We're not allowing our children to fail and learn from their mistakes and learn the lessons that we learned growing up that made us who we are today, that made us resilient.
Yeah.
What we're seeing today in our schools are things like teachers no longer being able to give a student a grade lower than a 60, or we are not penalizing students for being late to class or missing class completely. And my response to that is, what are we teaching our kids? We are teaching our kids that they can skate by and still pass. We're teaching our kids that in some cases you don't even have to show up and we're still going to give you a diploma. Our kids are not learning the things that they need to learn to be productive members of society. If they don't have to show up for class, where are they going to learn that they need to show up for work? They need to show up for other responsibilities, whether they be, familial or religious or whatever they want to do. Where are they going to learn the discipline and the responsibility that it takes to know what it means to accomplish something, to follow through on something, to be on time, to be present? Yeah. And I think a lot of people, especially after the pandemic, think, well, our kids they're real sensitive right now. And that's true. Some of them are. I don't discredit that at all, that some kids need a little extra attention. But for the vast majority of kids, by doing this, by taking away personal responsibility, we are actually harming our kids. We're not teaching them the things that they need to learn to be productive members of society.
Yeah. I love that. I always tell my wife and friends that I have that if you have a friend who needs to hear something and you're not saying it to them, or you're not unwilling to share, how is that person supposed to grow? Are these the kinds of doctors and scientists that we intend to put out in the field, people who weren't even graded or couldn't even have the chance to have criticism to be able to grow? I think all titles aside, a lot of this content that it seems is being taught in our public schools, I have questions about it. I have questions about where this is going to go. So can you dive into a little bit more about the history of social emotional learning and where we're at today with it?
Yeah, you bet. So where it all changed and where we get today's version of social emotional learning was in 1994 when a group called CASEL came into the picture. And it's a collaborative for academic, social, and emotional learning. And they actually popularized the term social emotional learning, which emerged from some individuals that have a history in the Fetzer Institute, and I'll let people go out and do their own Google research on the Fetzer Institute. It was an organization created by the radio magnate John Fetzer, who was devoted to the pursuit of New Age spiritualism and occultism. And so I don't think it's entirely inappropriate for someone to consider social emotional learning a cult. And one thing that I'll just point out is that when a cult is found out, they just reinvent themselves and become more vague. And let me give you an example of that. This theory called critical race theory started coming into our vocabulary, and it started coming into our schools. And right away, parents jumped all over it and said, no, we don't want this in our schools. And so legislation was passed that prohibited teaching critical race theory. But the people, the proponents, and those that were pushing critical race theory, they didn't stop. They just rebranded. And they went more broad, more vague, and created something called social emotional learning, which has now become the umbrella to bring in all of those critical theories: critical race theory, critical gender theory, sexuality theory, comprehensive sex education. So if that's something that we want people to understand, is that these critical theories haven't gone away. They are just being a little more clever about the pedagogy of these theories to our kids. And it's all under the umbrella of social emotional learning.
So just so our audience is clear, at least my understanding of critical race theory is it's an idea holding that racial bias is inherent in many ways and parts of Western society, especially in its legal and social institutions, on the basis of their having been primarily designed for and implemented by white people. Is that your understanding of what critical race theory is, or?
I think you pretty much nailed it. Critical race theory, yeah, I mean, if I can just, in my own words, critical race theory is the idea that everything in society is a result of someone oppressing someone else. And so it splits our society into two groups: the oppressors and the oppressed. And one thing I want to point out here, I think this is a good place to talk about this, is that, in my opinion, and I think a lot of other people have seen this, when you add in things like some of these critical theories, you hear a lot about inequities. And a word I've come to understand better in the past few years is the word transformation. When I hear the word transformation, the first thing that I think of in this context is the idea that we want to transform our society into something else. And if we look at what's going on, to me, it's pretty clear what those in power would like to transform our society into, and that is a more Marxist society. So if we go back to 1940s, 1950s, there was a group of Marxists. One of them was Herbert Marcuse, part of the Frankfurt School. They wanted to change us from a capitalist society to a Marxist society. But what they found was that in a capitalist society, the working class actually does very, very well. And so when you go further back in history and you look at other people's attempts to transform their society into a Marxist or communist society, they've predominantly focused on the working class and, the working conditions. And this is the oppressed class, is the working class. But in a capitalist society, the working class does very, very well. And so it's hard to get those people to see themselves as oppressed. And so what we need to do is we need to, again, transform. We need a new oppressed class. And so how do they go about doing this? And that's when we started seeing a lot about race and about gender. Anything that can get somebody to see themselves as oppressed, someone that doesn't have the same outcome or opportunities as someone else. And so they're trying to create a new oppressed class within our schools by introducing things like critical race theory and critical gender theory. Anyway, I want to move on. So CASEL has their definition of SEL, and they define SEL as an integral part of education and human development. Social emotional learning, SEL, is the process through which all young people and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities, manage emotions, and achieve personal and collective, Marxism, collectivism, goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain supportive relationships, and make responsible and caring decisions. So on the website, again, it sounds very flowery, and how can this be bad for our kids? But then we go to, again, back to their own documentation, and we hear things like they're shifting their ambitions from shaping national level education systems to intervening in the shaping of children's personalities. We can see very quickly that there's quite nefarious undercurrent to all of this. One way I've grown up with this idea of you are who you keep company with. And so if we look at this next slide of who supports social emotional learning, CASEL obviously, but then we get into the World Economic Forum, United Nations, the World Bank, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, USAID, all of these organizations that are trying to create this global civilization, to trying to get rid of borders. They use this term, a global citizen. There's no such thing as a global citizen because a citizen is someone that is under a sovereign. And so it's just kind of interesting that they're using these terms that I think they themselves that sound good when they say them, but if you think about them, they just don't make sense. So back to CASEL. CASEL has what they call the CASEL 5, and these are the focus of all social emotional learning programs that are in our schools. In Gilbert Public Schools, we use one called Second Step. There's other programs out there. In Higley, they use one called Leader in Me. But all of these social emotional learning programs, they all have to go through the crucible of CASEL and make sure that the focus is on the CASEL 5. And so if we look at these, the first one is self-awareness, understanding one's emotions, becoming aware of your personal and social identity. Again, it sounds great, but when we teach it from a place of gender and racial identity, you can see how it lends itself to that oppressed and oppressor mentality.
I can tell you as a father, I would not want my daughter going to a public school and being taught to recognize race and act differently according to that. Yeah. I think that's...
I don't think you're alone. I think there's a lot of parents that we think we're sending our kids to school to learn the ABCs and the 1, 2, 3s. But when we learn that focus of our children's education, even if it's just a brief portion of every day, is focused on things like self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, responsible decision-making, and what those mean and how they're taught, I think a lot of us would maybe have second thoughts about sending our kids to school. So they say that it takes 10,000 hours to become a professional at something. If you want to become a professional basketball player, spend 10,000 hours practicing basketball, and you'll become a professional. Now, obviously, there's other things that come into consideration there. When we look at our kids and how much time they spend in school, from kindergarten to 12th grade, our kids are in school almost 19,000 hours.
Wow.
So if it takes 10,000 hours to become a professional at something, our kids are in school for almost twice that. They're becoming a professional twice over at whatever these education companies, these edutech or educational companies want to be teaching our kids. And that's a scary thought.
I remember when I was in school, self-awareness pretty much broke down to treat others how you'd like to be treated.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We all know that as the golden rule. Treat others as you want to be treated. Well, they've hijacked that term or that rule, and now the rule is treat others as you think they want to be treated. And it's a subtle shift, but it has really big implications, because now if I need to treat somebody, or if we need to treat somebody as we think they want to be treated, now all of a sudden we're being forced to recognize things like preferred pronouns, for example.
Right.
So that's just an observation.
So it seems like a lot of these things, like you said, on their face, I mean, self-awareness is great. You want kids to be self-aware, but it seems like some of the definitions that I'm used to seeing in terms of what's listed here is a little bit different from what I'm used to. So tell us about the self-management. That's the next tenet of the Castle 5.
So a lot of the Castle 5, ultimately, the purpose is to create awareness in our kids of what's going on around them socially. And if it was organic, that would be fine. But when what's going on around us socially is being manufactured by people with an agenda, it creates an environment for our kids to, again, force themselves to identify as either an oppressed person or an oppressor. And it's forcing our kids to look at their social environment, and it's a social environment that has been manufactured by those with an agenda. And so its goal is to create activists out of our kids. And in fact, in the Second Step program, which in Gilbert Public Schools we've implemented from K through 6th grade, but in the middle school programming, in 8th grade, there's actually assignments that require kids to become active about a social injustice. And they actually, as part of their assignment, they are supposed to do something disruptive. As our kids get older and as these lessons become more and more advanced, we can see the direction that they're wanting to take our kids into becoming activists, into creating the new working class, essentially, so that they've got, 1 or 2 or 3 generations of kids who all think in a certain way. And that way, when it's time to make a change, they can do so very, very quickly with very little opposition. So just to sum up here, a couple of slides. I've got a slide here of a frog relaxing in some boiling water. I think we've all heard that the way to boil frogs is not to throw it in boiling water, because it would just jump right out. But the way to do it is to put a frog in a pot of room temperature water and slowly crank the heat up. And I feel like that's what is being done to our kids. I feel like our kids are being sent to our schools, and our schools for a long time have been room temperature water. But now we are cranking that heat up, and kids and parents, it's hard for us to recognize that we're boiling. And then this last slide is just a visual of how social emotional learning is the hypodermic needle for things like critical race theory, queer theory, gender ideology, identity theory, and all these different critical theories that are going to be taught to our kids in a way that forces them to identify as a certain class other than what we as their parents would want them to identify as: a son or a daughter, or a grandson or a granddaughter, a Christian or a Muslim, or anything that we as parents try to instill in our kids. Every day we're sending them off for 8 hours a day. And I hate to use the word brainwashing, but when it's broken down into its simplest form, social emotional learning is brainwashing our kids. What we're going to find is that kids are going to increasingly reject the teachings of their parents and grandparents, and they're going to buy into this philosophy of oppression. They're not even going to know it, because as parents, we're sending our kids to these schools every day to be indoctrinated with this stuff. I do want to point out on a message of hope at the end here, we can stop this. We can stop this. We can let our school boards know, and not just in Gilbert, but all around the country, we can let our school boards know this is not okay. there are so many resources that individuals and parents can use to learn more about the dark truth of social emotional learning. There's people out there, again, much smarter than myself, that really dive deep into the dangers of social emotional learning. And I encourage people to learn as much as they can about it, because back to the beginning of our presentation, I really think that the way for either side to affect the outcome that they want is through our kids in our public schools. And so thankfully, there are a lot of other school districts out there that are much further along than Gilbert Public Schools. I feel like Gilbert Public Schools is doing a really good job at still focusing on the kids, focusing on their education, but I can see things slipping really quickly by making decisions that other districts have made that have led to them being in the situations that they're in.
Yeah. Well, Chad, we really appreciate your time today on social emotional learning. And I can tell you personally, as a resident of Gilbert, that it's very comforting to know that there are school board members out there whose main focus is academics. Because again, in a state where we are suffering, we are ranked very near the back as far as academics, I think. We just don't have the time to lose focus. And so we appreciate what you're doing there. We appreciate the explanation of social emotional learning. We look forward to learning more about it. And thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.